This is the copy of the sermon that will be preached on Sunday the 18th of June at North Shields Evangelical Church. Different to normal, I'm going to actually read the Bible verses as we go through. What do the following things have in common? A stapler that says, "Do not remove from the office desk." A dandelion. A Monopoly piece. A snail. And a fork. What do they all have in common? Vulnerability. The office stapler. It says it wants to stay on the office desk. It tells everyone, "Do not remove me from the office desk." But no matter what happens, no matter what it says, its destiny is in the hands of other people, who'll take it wherever they decide. A dandelion. The dandelion, it makes its home in one place, but wherever the wind takes it, that is where it will end up. A Monopoly piece. The destiny of a Monopoly piece is in the hands of random chance. Roller 1, pick up a chance. Congratulations, you have won £100 in a crossword competition. Roller, different number. Go to jail. Do not pass go. Do not collect £200. A snail. A snail carries everything it owns in the house on its back. And then crunch. Disaster strikes as someone bigger steps out of their house and steps onto him. A fork, or rather a fork in the road. Take a left turn and it could turn out to be a great decision, but it could also turn out to be a bad decision, and you've no way of turning around. The experience of these items is not unique. We're all vulnerable to the decisions of others. You might be in a place that you like, a place of good health and great circumstances, a place that you want to stay. But suddenly, life or someone makes a decision and things change. We're all vulnerable, like dandelions, to the wind of life. Whatever way the wind of life blows, that is where you're heading. It might turn out to be really good, or it might turn out to be really bad. So many things in life have the potential to crush us. Things were great and then everything gets taken away from it. Some diagnosis or some disaster robs us of the life that we had. And what a scary thought to think. We might choose left when choosing right would have been better, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's too late. As I read this passage from the book of Acts, I really want you to see and feel Paul's vulnerability. Just for context, Paul had asked to go to Rome to stand trial, and God had promised him that it was his purpose that Paul reached Rome. Proclaiming the gospel in Rome was really crucial to spreading the gospel far and wide. It was crucial to the growth and spread of the church. And yet I really want you to see and feel the helplessness, the vulnerability of the Apostle Paul to bring any of these things about. Reading from Acts chapter 27. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy. Who decided? Not Paul. Paul's destiny was in the hands of the decisions of others. When it was decided that we should set sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. Who's in charge? Who's calling the shots? Not Paul, but someone else. Verse 2. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends, so they might provide for his needs. Paul is clearly in a weakened state that is visible to others, so that even his prison master has sympathy and allows Paul's friends to care for his physical needs. Verse 4. From there we put out to sea again and passed the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. Every turn Paul takes from now on will be at the mercy of the wind. Verse 5. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cineas. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty, and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lycia. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous. You know, on the sea, you're as dangerous and vulnerable as this snail in the middle of Eldon Square. It had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, Men, I see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and even to our own lives also. Paul makes a request. Let me stay here where it's safe. Danger is ahead. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Once the harbour was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. There was a harbour in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. The sailors rolled the dice, hopeful that chance would favour them, and things initially turned out good. They'd chosen the right fork in the road. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Corda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Everybody is starting to realize their snail-like vulnerability. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Paul has known how vulnerable he was all throughout this journey, and now the soldiers and sailors are beginning to realize it as well. Their reaction? To give up all hope of being saved. The stakes of the ship sinking are pretty big, but for Paul and for the gospel, the stakes are even bigger. Jesus had promised to the apostles, You will be my witness in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. To the disciples, Rome, the place where Paul was heading, was the ends of the earth. Their map was a lot smaller than ours. To us who look back on these events, Rome was the gateway to the rest of the world. Rome had a system of roads that spread far and wide. The Roman Empire would spread across Europe. Early on, there was less opposition in Rome to the new religions, which would give the church time and breathing space to grow. Paul reaching Rome was crucial to the spread of the gospel. But Paul was helpless, at the mercy of random events and the decisions of other people. And because Paul was as vulnerable and as weak as us, the outlook did not look good. Now I ask you if you're a member of North Shields Evangelical Church or a church similar to ours. Now I ask you, how are you going to respond to the same situation? If I'm honest, our church that I'm part of, we're in a very vulnerable situation. The next roll of the dice could send us in any direction. Your church leaders don't know the right fork in the road to take. Anything could crush us in a moment. At such times, are we going to cling on to the promises of God as hard as the Apostle Paul? Verse 21 of Acts chapter 27. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, Men, you should have taken my advice and not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God whom I belong to and whom I serve stood before me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar in Rome, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Paul kept clinging to God's promises despite the negative outlook. He would arrive in Rome, despite the winds, despite the random rolls of the dice, despite forks in the road being taken that turned out bad. Paul believed that God was sovereign. Paul believed that God's promise would be fulfilled. Now, as we think to apply this, it's important to note God has not made any specific promises about any local church, any specific church building. God is sovereign over what happens in the life of the specific church that me and our church members are a part of. And so within our locality, it's essential we cling on to this and other promises that God has made. Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. The gospel is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. And Paul said himself in 2 Corinthians, But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Feelings of vulnerability, weakness, inability, it's not a new thing. God has always spread his gospel through weak, vulnerable, unimpressive people. I don't know if you heard me read out your name there. I heard mine. God has always spread his gospel through weak, vulnerable, and unimpressive people. And we're to cling on to this promise, like Paul. And, like Paul, we are called to act. Verse 25, Paul said, So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. On the 14th night we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later they took soundings again and found that it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In their attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Paul is the strongest believer in God's sovereignty on that ship. Paul is the one who holds to God's promises with the greatest conviction. God is going to help him to arrive at Rome. What is Paul's response? To fold his arms, take a nap, to wait to arrive in Rome? No. Paul insists that the sailors make the best decision they can with the information they have at the time. Then he tells the centurion and soldiers to take action when things take a bad turn. Paul urges them all to do as much as they can to strengthen themselves with food. And though it's not stated clearly, I presume Paul was influential in getting them to get on their knees and pray for conditions to improve. The fact that God is sovereign, the fact that God will fulfill his promises, are not an excuse for God's people to down-tool and to sit on their hands. As R.T. Kendall once said, God does not honour our logic, he honours our obedience. Logic might say, why pray if God already knows? Why witness when God's already chosen those who are going to be saved? Why attempt to make wise decisions when God will make sure his will is done anyway? Why take action when God will fulfill his promises without us? Answers? I don't know. But one thing I do know, God does not honour our logic, he honours our faith and obedience. And as Paul demonstrates, the ones who have the most faith are the ones who take the most action. And faith-driven action is what God is calling us all to as well. To act, to cling to his promises, that God will build his church, that he will spread the gospel, that people will be saved. If we believe those promises, we're to pray, to go, to speak, and to act. Now I'm going to read the rest of the passage and apply it now on a more individual level. Chapter 27, verse 39. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could to swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper driven out by the heat fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the snake off into the sea fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honoured us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. After 3 months we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship with the figurehead of the twin gods, Castor and Pollux. We put in at Syracuse and stayed there 3 days. From there we set sail and arrived at Rhegium. The next day the south wind came up, and on the following day we reached Puteoli. There we found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend a week with them, and so we came to Rome. The brothers and sisters there had heard that we were coming, and they travelled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. When he got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. Despite random rolls of the dice, despite winds and forks in the road taking Paul here, there and everywhere, God gets Paul where he wants him to be, in Rome. But the journey to get there involved a significant amount of trust from Paul. I mean, just take note of how many disasters occurred en route. The ship does a Titanic and hits a sandbar. It then begins to break up. Later on, they swim and float to land, get drenched, step on land, and it rains. And then Paul gets bit by a snake. I'd ask you how you'd feel if all these disasters happened to you, but I suspect I'd need earplugs. And plus some of you already know how Paul would feel, because you've had these types of days yourselves. Days where everything just seems to go wrong. With this in mind, I'd like to tell you a bit about something called Chekhov's gun. Chekhov's gun is a storytelling technique where every detail will prove relevant later on. Chekhov said, if there's a gun hanging on the wall in Act 1, Scene 1, it will get fired at some point during Act 2 or 3. To give a few examples, if at the beginning of James Bond, Q gives him a gadget that can poke a 3-eyed shark in the eye, then you know that later on in the film that James Bond is going to have to fight a 3-eyed shark. If the soldier's girlfriend gives him a metal case as he leaves for war, a case containing her photo that he's to place close to his heart, what's going to happen later on? Well, the bullet's going to hit him there, and the case will have saved him. If a character in a film tells you that they're violently allergic to Coca-Cola flavoured jelly beans, well, at some point in the film they're going to be fed one and have a violent allergic reaction. If the Egyptian tour guide tells you that if anyone enters the pyramid wearing pink underpants, it will awaken a terrible curse, what's going to happen in the film? Hopefully you've got it yourself. Chekhov's gun. In a story, every object, every random detail, every bit of information in Act 1 will serve some purpose in Act 2 or 3. Now I want you to go through chapters 27 and chapter 28 with Chekhov's gun in mind. Act 1. Several disasters. Paul tells the centurion that storms lie ahead. The centurion does not listen. They get hit by a violent storm and have to throw all their cargo overboard. They also get shipwrecked and have to swim, float on debris to land. And they arrive on land in soaked clothes, and it begins to rain. Cold rain. Paul puts some firewood on a fire to stay warm and gets bitten by a viper. Now take note of Chekhov's gun at work. Acts 2 and 3. The centurion didn't listen to Paul's earlier bit of advice, but because it turned out that Paul was right, the centurion begins to respect Paul. Later, when the soldiers thought it best to kill the prisoners in case they swam away in the shipwreck and escaped, the centurion sticks up for Paul and has him saved. The crew have to throw all their cargo overboard, and they arrived in Malta with nothing, not even a ship. But this might have influenced the natives of Malta to show them unusual kindness. It sounds like unkindness to strangers was the norm, such as stealing cargo and hijacking ships, neither of which the crew now had. The wet and cold crew land on Malta only for it to rain, cold rain. But this causes the natives to offer them shelter and a warm fire. A relationship forms which later results in the natives sending the crew with all the resources they need for their long journey to Rome. Paul gets bitten by a snake, painful, but by some miracle he survives. News spreads, leading to an open door for Paul to minister to the sick in Malta, spreading God's compassion to the needy people in the island. So many of the disasters in Act 1 proved to have relevance in Acts 2 and 3. Did Paul realise this at the time? No, he probably responded to these disasters with righteous negativity. They were bad, no matter what good came from them later on. Nor was Paul called to attempt to read into his every circumstance, trying to convince himself that all that was bad would turn out for good. There were plenty of bad things that happened that didn't seem to serve any later purpose. But Paul was simply called to trust that God knew what he was doing, even when times were bad. Even in the bad, God was fully in control. Even in the bad, God was squeezing out as much good as possible. Now what about you? Are you feeling vulnerable to life's randomness? It can be very unsettling. It can also be upsetting when one bad thing happens after another. At these times, it's worth remembering that God is sovereign. This doesn't mean we'll ever be able to make full sense of it. It doesn't mean we're to read God's purpose into every random thing that happens to us. It doesn't mean that we're to pretend that bad things are good. But we are to remember that God is still fully in control and fully able, like Chekhov's gun, to squeeze out some purpose, some good, later on. And that's God's definition of good, not ours. As it says in Romans, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son,